So we talked about physical and cognitive development during adolescence, and now let's focus a little bit on emotional and social development during that same period. So we find that friendships during adolescence are extremely important, and they're usually important in determining where exactly will the adolescent fall in terms of their attitudes and their politics and their personality, so on and so forth. And we find, for example, that adolescents' attitudes fall somewhere in the middle between their parents and their peers, showing how much of an influence peer relationships have over the trajectory of adolescence. A very central concept in emotional and social development during adolescence, especially for minority status individuals and minority status adolescents, is this concept of the formation of ethnic identity, or the feeling of belonging to a particular ethnic or cultural group, or identifying with a particular cultural or ethnic group. Okay? And it turns out that ethnic identity and the lack of formation of ethnic identity may serve to exacerbate some issues during adolescence, and for that reason, appropriate development of ethnic identity can actually function as a protective factor. Finney is a researcher who devised a three-stage theory of ethnic identity, and he talked about the first stage of ethnic identity development as what he called the unexamined ethnic identity. And this is when the adolescent is not at all searching for their ethnic identity, and in fact, they don't really perceive themselves to be any different from anyone around them. In the second stage is when the adolescent begins to notice that they're ethnically, racially, or culturally different from people around them. And this is when an ethnic identity search takes place. Sometimes the ethnic identity search concludes with what Finney called the third stage of that ethnic identity development theory, and he called that third stage ethnic identity achievement. And as the name goes, that's when adolescents achieve a certain ethnic identity or come to identify with a particular ethnic or cultural group. As mentioned a few seconds ago, it turns out that a formation of an ethnic identity, so getting to that third stage of ethnic identity achievement, may actually function to buffer against some stress for minority status adolescents. Another really important concept in the emotional and social development of adolescence is the concept of gender and the search for a gender identity. And a gender identity is a person's sense of being a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. Some research is actually telling us that during the time of adolescence, something called gender intensification happens. And this is when boys or girls become, whatever sense of their gender they have, okay, becomes polarized towards the extreme end of a stereotypical masculinity and stereotypical femininity, and we call this concept gender intensification, which happens during adolescence. And again, what that means is it's basically being pushed towards the extreme ends of if you identify a boy or a man, during adolescence, this intensifies and polarizes to look more stereotypically masculine, and for boys or for girls and women, that also tends to, if they're falling more on that side of the continuum, that tends to intensify and polarize and become more stereotypically feminine. For some researchers, the search for a gender identity is so central to the concept of self that it is an organizing theme in which to interpret all other experiences. And that's Bem's gender schema theory. And in gender schema theory, gender is really viewed as this higher level filter through which the child or the adolescent starts seeing the world, organizing the world, trying to interpret or understand their perceptions of the world. And during this time of adolescence and during the development of gender identity, sometimes children develop a shorthand of a concept, and this is again reminiscent of Piaget's concept of what a schema is. It's during this time that a pretty clear picture of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, at least from the societal structures, begins to formulate in the adolescent's mind. Okay, so this is what a schema looks like. It's experiences that would tell you things fit within the schema of what a boy is. Okay, so it's all based on personal experiences, and it becomes a bit solidified during the adolescent process. And it turns out that adolescent self-esteem is really tied into these gender-based perceptions and gender-based schemas. And if you want a graphical picture of what that looks like, so here's society's beliefs and stereotypes about what is stereotypically female, what is stereotypically male, and that functions to help the child create a gender schema, a shorthand of concepts related to what it means to be boy or a man, girl or a woman. And then this gender schema is then the filter through which important other experiences in life, social information processing, things about self-esteem and who you are, attitudes about gender, etc. The schema is the filter through which these important experiences are categorized, are understood, are perceived. So as mentioned, friendships are quite important during adolescence. And part of this importance is that friendships sometimes function as this gateway, and this gateway is towards intimacy. And friendships really do set the stage for what looks like adult intimacy, and it begins as early as adolescence. And for this and many other reasons, peer relationships, as mentioned when we talked a little bit about attitudes, peer relationships are quite important as they are a gateway to learning about intimacy, to learning about sex, etc. So given their importance, when friendships don't work out during adolescence, and given how central they are to the adolescent's self-esteem and self-concept, the child's self-confidence is undermined when these relationships are shaken and when they fall apart, unfortunately. Okay? Sexuality is a very important part of obviously growing up, an important part of adolescence. Okay? And most adolescents will tell you that sexual intimacy is an important part of growing up. And there is research to actually support the idea that adolescents are having sexual experiences. This may or may not be physical in nature, but they're having sexual experiences at younger and younger ages. And for the most part, this is extremely normative. As mentioned, adolescents are trying to learn about who they are, and learning about who they are needs an exploration of sexuality as well. However, and even though the majority of sexual experiences at a younger age are not typically problematic, so there are certain sexual experiences or consequences of sexual experiences that put teenagers and adolescents on a different trajectory and a harsher trajectory, again, typically speaking. And that is when there's teenage pregnancy involved and childbearing for teenage mothers. That sometimes it does have very serious consequences on the maturity and the milestones that the adolescent is reaching, in the sense that you're put on a completely different trajectory of stress. You're now left caring for a child when other important milestones related to growing up in this period of adolescence are either being missed or they're done belaboredly, if you will. Okay, so the consequences of childbearing may in fact be serious. Again, we're talking averages, we're talking typical trends. It's not going to be true for everyone. A sad reality of growing up, and as mentioned in the very first few slides that we talked about, adolescence is a very tumultuous time to be growing up. It's a very stressful time to grow up because children are trying to negotiate who they are as people. They're trying to learn their place in the world. And like I said, for that reason, it can be quite stressful as a time. And unfortunately, the stress can lead to a number of spikes in mental health symptoms. And the research is really showing us that teenagers are at a higher risk to attempt suicide during that time. And in fact, the teenagers attempt suicide more often than do adults. However, adults tend to die by suicide more. So teenagers attempt more, adults tend to die more by suicide. With that said, the trajectory and the research is really telling us that death by suicide is increasing all over the world, especially in the critical period of about 15 or 14 to about 25. And in fact, it's become one of the number one killers of people of that age. So it's a really troubling and very unfortunate trend that we're seeing nowadays. We also understand that Canadian adolescent males are more likely to die from suicide, whereas females are more likely to attempt. And that usually is a difference in the lethality of the methods chosen by males versus females. When females, I guess fortunately in this case, pick less lethal means to die by suicide, whereas males, typically speaking, again, tend to pick more lethal methods, and that leads to more death by suicide. Again, very unfortunate and tragic trends that we're seeing. So we talked about physical development and cognitive and emotional development during adolescence. Now let's focus in on a different period of development, and this is development during adulthood. And the first thing we shall discuss is physical development during adulthood. So it's important for us to discuss physical changes during this period of adulthood because we are increasing in longevity. We are expected to live 80 plus years if you're born 2012 and later. So most people nowadays live well into their 70s and well into their 80s. So it's no longer, our concern is no longer to get to adulthood and live a few fulfilled years during adulthood. Our concern is really to live a disability-free and fulfilled life for as long as possible. And that age, it tends to be creeping up now. So overall, the trend here is that there are lots of changes that happen in childhood and adolescence in terms of physical growth, physical strength, and agility is at a peak in our early 20s, but we see some declines in the 30s and 40s. It's not really any pronounced. Okay, so there's some loss in agility and speed from 30s and 40s to, compared to 20s. Having said that, there is a bigger rate of change that is happening between about 40 and 60. We see greater losses in agility and strengths. With that all said, there are things that we can do, and the research is showing is actually quite effective in minimizing physical declines, and that includes things like strength training, physical activity generally, playing sports, and eating right, it turns out. So there are lifestyle factors in which we can engage in. At least gives us a higher likelihood of living a longer, less disability-ridden life in our older age. We all grow older, and when we're growing older, we have to contend with something, which is the loss of sensory, the loss of sensitivity to our sensory organs, if you will. Okay, so early adulthood, for the most part, most sensory abilities are relatively stable and relatively intact. Eventually, though, as we grow older, as I mentioned, we must contend with inevitable memory loss. And one of the first things that we notice in terms of memory or in terms of sensory loss is the loss of hearing, which can begin as early as 25. And again, these changes are very minute as to not affect everyday functioning, but they do exist. And as mentioned earlier, they become more and more pronounced as we age. So now let's talk a little bit about social and personality development during adulthood. Perhaps one of the more influential theories in developmental psychology, probably close to its influence of Piaget's theory of cognitive development, is Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. And unlike Piaget's theory, which kind of ends right around adolescence, around the age of 12, is the last discernible stage that Piaget talks about in cognitive development, Erikson's stages deal with the entirety of the lifespan. So it doesn't necessarily stop at 12 years. Okay, so the first 4 stages of his psychosocial stages of development theory all occur around the same time as Piaget's proposed changes, which is, again, the first 12 years of life. And Erikson's stages kind of look like crises that everybody needs to contend with and everybody needs to resolve. And how people resolve these crises, as is manifest in these stages, can really determine living a fulfilled social and emotional life, or, again, according to Erikson, it could mean living a less fulfilled and a less content life, unfortunately. One of the very first things that we need to understand about the world in which we live, and this happens in the first stage of Erikson's psychosocial theory of development, is this crisis of, can I trust people around me? Can I trust that the world in which I find myself in is a safe one that will provide for my needs? Or will I develop mistrust in the world and in the guardians that are taking care of me? Okay? So that crisis, if it's resolved appropriately, which is, according to Erikson, which is basically you start having basic trust in people, basic trust in the environment, that the environment will give you what you need, so on and so forth. And then you move into the second stage, which is anywhere from about 1.5 years to about 3 years, where one of the very first things that you're learning during that time is your potty training, for example. So during this stage 2, the crisis to be solved here is, will I learn the new skills that my parents are trying to impart upon me? Will I become autonomous? Will I be able to do it myself? Or will I dwindle into shame and into doubt because I cannot obtain these skills that they're trying to teach me? Okay? So the appropriate resolution, obviously, is a sense of autonomy, a sense that, yes, I can learn these skills. Yes, I can do what my parents have taught me, so on and so forth. And I can become autonomous. I can do things on my own. And then in the third stage, anywhere from 3 to 6 years in Erikson's psychosocial theory of development, is this idea of initiative versus guilt, which surrounds starting school. And the basic crisis to be solved is, will I be able to initiate social friendships as a youngster, or will I be met with this sense of guilt? And the fourth stage is more about scholastic achievements. It's more about how well you do in school. And the basic crisis to be solved here is one of industry versus inferiority. Meaning, will I become industrious? Will I produce? Will I achieve? Or will I start developing the concept of myself as inferior, as not as good as everybody else. And that, again, depending on how that particular stage or crisis is resolved, could mean you could be put on a very different trajectory. In the fifth stage, during adolescence, one task that we all have to contend with is this crisis of, will I form my own identity? Will I become my own individual? Or will I be confused about who I am, which is role confusion? So during this very stressful period of adolescence, there's a lot of growth, but there's also a lot of stress and turmoil. And the stress and turmoil is really surrounding whether or not people will become individuated, will become their own individuals with their own attitudes, with their own skills, so on and so forth. So that's really the crux of Erikson's fifth stage. Will it be resolved in a clear identity, or will that stage be resolved in some kind of a role confusion as to what my role is as an adult? Sixth stage is relating to young adulthood. And in the sixth stage, the task that we have to contend with is one of intimacy versus isolation. And this is when young adults are beginning to experiment, but also beginning to commit to lasting and intimate relationships. And the resolution to that stage, according to Erikson and his theory, is finding intimacy, finding a relationship in which you can share your life with someone. And unfortunately, the alternative to that is isolation, not finding that intimate relationship that, according to Erikson, is super important for emotional development during that period. In the seventh stage, and this is middle adulthood, the thing to solve here is, will I impart or convey information, love, security to generations after me, or will my life and my work be stagnant? Will I be self-absorbed? And this is really the crisis to be resolved in Erikson's seventh stage related to middle adulthood. Will I, and it really is precipitated by people's awareness of their own death, their own mortality. Okay? Becoming aware of your own mortality makes you think about, what do I have to offer future generations, because I'm not going to be around forever. And that's really where crises related to, am I going to be industrious or am I going to stagnate? This is where the crisis comes from. And then the final stage of life, older adulthood, according to Erikson's psychosocial stages, is this eighth stage, which is about ego integrity versus despair. And this is when a person starts to reevaluate their life, if you will, and come up with a summation of their life. Did I live a meaningful, productive, happy life, or did I waste my life? Was it unproductive? Was it not useful, if you will? And if the answer is the latter, that is, if the answer is life was wasteful, unproductive, so on and so forth, that's what you come up with in your mind in your evaluations of your life looking back, that can obviously lead to, lack of fulfillment, and it could lead to regret, and it could lead to miserable few last years of your life, again, according to Erikson. However, if the answer is, yes, I led a meaningful, happy, productive life, then the answer, according to Erikson, is one of fulfillment, one of joy. So that's Erikson's 8 stages relating to his psychosocial theory of human development. So let's talk a little bit about some statistics. And then one thing that I want you to note is how wildly different we are from generations previously, but also the fact that many important milestones in life are actually changing, and they're happening much, much later. A, because we're living much longer. B, because education is becoming more and more and more important to get a proper career, to get a livable salary, if you will. And obviously education takes time. And for that reason, now more than ever, young people are living at home, at their parental home, for a long, long time, at least much longer than what it used to be. So, for example, in 2001, only about 20% of people 18 to 25 lived at home. In 2016, that number was 35%. So there's an incredible increase here in the number of people who have never left or returned to their parental home. And it turns out that men are more likely to be living at home at this young age than young women. There are other changes that are happening as well. We find that at 18 to 40, as mentioned earlier, it's a time for exploration, not only in social relationships, emotional relationships, but also it's an exploration that happens vocationally. So there's lots of career changes that typically happen anywhere from 18 to 40. Typically speaking, people change jobs 10.5 times, anywhere from 18 to 40. And we know that job satisfaction declines a little bit in that middle adulthood period, from young adulthood to adulthood. So again, lots of things that are happening during that time. We also know that there have been a lot of recent change in milestones related to love and commitment. So as mentioned, love and marriage are great things, of course, but they can be extremely stressful. And if you're changing jobs 10.5 times, and if you're staying at home trying to get an education, it means that people are getting married for the very first time at much later years, but also less and less people are getting married as a result. So to compare 1981 statistics to 2011 statistics, in 1981, 61% of people were legally married. In 2011, just as a comparison, and I imagine these numbers will probably change even further if we examine them right now. In 2011, that number was about 46%. So it's a drop of about 15% of the number of people who are legally married just in the 30 years here examined. Also, the age at which people get married is increasing over time. In 1960 to about 1970, the average age for women to first get married is 23, average age for men 25. Those numbers in 2008, which is over 10 years ago, is about 30 for women and about 31 for men. And there are other important changes in societal roles, and one of the very important societal role that lots of people play is parenthood. And it turns out that the average age at which people are becoming parents for the first time is increasing, much like other statistics we discussed. For example, only 24% of all births were for women over the age of 30 in 1981. This number in 2011 is 52% of all Canadian births are of women who are ages 30 and up. The average age at which people are becoming parents for the first time is about 29 in 2011. There are a few things that we know about parenthood and marital satisfaction. We know, for example, that marital satisfaction tends to go down around the birth of the first baby, and it tends to stay there for a few years when the child is young, and then it tends to bounce back over time, especially when the kids are about school age. It turns out that there are a lot of stereotypes and a lot of legends around midlife. And these two that are relatively persistent are midlife crisis and the empty nest syndrome, which are two legends that people have folklorically around middle adulthood. And the first one is midlife crisis, which is defined as this emotional distress one gets when they're faced with their own mortality and during middle adulthood. And typically speaking, as the legend goes, people start to latch on to anything that reminds them of their youth and to try to regain their youth in some way. So I'll give you an example. For men who are stereotypically going through their midlife crisis, they may, for example, buy a fancy sports car. Turns out, midlife crises is more myth than it is reality. There's really hardly any research to support that there is such a midlife crisis that happens for lots of people. And then there's another concept, which is this empty nest syndrome concept, which is the period of depression or low mood that oftentimes mothers go through when children move out of the home to go to university or to join the workforce, etc. And again, it turns out that this dip in mood or the increase in anxiety and depression symptoms is overstated. Yes, there is likely a dip in in the mother's mood when children move out of the home, but it turns out that it's very transient and it's not very pronounced. So we talked about physical changes and social development during adulthood. There's something else, unfortunately, we have to contend with, which is that there are cognitive changes that take place, especially for people who are over the age of 65. Up until that point, though, up until about the age of 65, there are decrements in or declines in learning and memory. So your learning and memory is not going to continue being the same. However, the changes that happen during this period, up until about 65, are again very minute and unlikely to be the source of any issues when it comes to everyday functioning. There are bigger age-related cognitive decrements and declines after the age of 65. And many of them continue to be or have little to do with day-to-day functioning. However, growing old is not easy, and that's partly because there are a lot of negative stereotypes about aging and about being old. And these stereotypes, much like stereotypes about other things, really do hold us back as a nation, and they will continue to hold us back as a nation because the population of Canadians over the age of 65, it turns out that this population is growing. So in 2011, about 14.4% of the population was 65 and older. This proportion is expected to increase to about 19% by the year 2021. And here's other projections. By the year 2031, the population of people over the age of 65 is expected to be about 23%. And by 2061, the population of people 65 and over are expected to be 26% or over a quarter of all Canadians. So really, negative stereotypes and ageism really do hold us back as a society, especially when this segment of the population is going to increase, and we're all going to be part of that statistic eventually, or at least if we're lucky. So there are many myths, and as I mentioned, stereotypes about growing older. One thing is for sure, many elderly individuals are very competent and capable, and they're just as competent as capable as they were in their earlier years. And how engaged older people are in their life is actually one of the most important factors or predictors of how well they'll adapt as they grow older. Okay, so having an engaged life is extremely important. However, things like stereotypes and things like ageism really do hold older people back from getting engaged with life, that is. Ageism is a prejudice against the elderly, and it's a negative stereotype that they're less capable, for example, that they're that they're less healthy, so on and so forth. And oftentimes, this prejudice, these stereotypical negative attitudes, spill over into behavior and start predicting negative behavior towards the elderly, and we call that discrimination. If you reverse the stereotypes and you actually see people through positive lenses, they're less likely to suffer from the behavioral consequences of ageism, which are really unfortunate given the growing population of the elderly. There are realities that we have to deal with, and as mentioned, we all have to deal with some cognitive decline as we age. As mentioned again, many elderly people live long, healthy lives. However, really unfortunate and tragic outcome related to growing older, and these are dementias. And dementias are progressive impairment in functioning, especially cognitive or mental functioning. And there are two types of dementias. One type of it that's reversible, we call those reversible dementias, and more often than not, they're caused or are related to things like malnutrition, alcohol abuse, toxins in the environment, for example. And more often than not, these reversible dementias affect younger people. There's another type, unfortunately, though, of dementias, and those are irreversible forms of dementias. We call those multiple infarct dementias, and more often than not, they're associated with things like strokes and something called Alzheimer's disease, which is this very complex disease for which we have no cure, unfortunately, to present day. And Alzheimer's disease is pervasive and involves a number of areas of functioning, including memory. So in Alzheimer's disease, there's often pretty severe memory loss that continues to deteriorate, deterioration in language, visual skills, spatial skills, and sometimes there are even pronounced changes to one's attitudes, one's personality, because of course your personality lives inside the brain, and if it's a brain disorder that atrophies the brain over time, then you will get those changes in personality eventually as the disease progresses. And as mentioned, unfortunately, to date, there are no effective treatments or cures for Alzheimer's disease. However, there are many, many advances that we're seeing in diagnosing Alzheimer's disease, but also advances that we're making in understanding the disorder and treating it. Every single day I turn on the news, there's a new discovery related to Alzheimer's disease treatment. So we're heading in the right direction, and I hope we get there faster. So here are figures of the incidence of dementia by age caused by Alzheimer's disease or by stroke. And this is pretty dated now, I guess, about 20 years dated. The incidence here, as you will see, increases depending on which age bracket you look at. The incidence of Alzheimer's and dementias really skyrocket over the age of 85 here for both men and for women. Finally, we get to an old, ripe age, and then we have to deal, as we all must deal, young or old, with the last chapter, and that's death, which is the end of life. There is a field of study in psychology and medicine called Thanatology, which is very much dedicated to understanding death and dying and aspects or factors related to death and dying. For those of you who are interested in the Avengers series, Thanos actually comes from a Latin word related to death. That's where the word Thanos comes from, and that's where the word Thanatology comes from. Until next time.